So during this webinar, you will hear about research recently published by our three speakers. This research examines the net zero and climate action claims made by the Pathways Alliance, which is a group of 6 oil sand producers that collectively represent 95% of oil sand production. During their presentations and answers to your questions, our speakers will offer insights and tools for identifying greenwashing and how communicators can address it. Our speakers today are, first, Dr. Melissa Aronczyk. Dr. Aronczyk is a professor of media studies in the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers University. She is the co-author of the book titled A Strategic Nature, Public Relations and the Politics of Environmentalism. She is a winner of the 2023 Roderick P. Hart Outstanding Book Award in Political Communication and the 2022 Outstanding Book Award in Public Relations, Innovation, Development, and Educational Achievement, both from the National Communication Association. Our next speaker is Dr. Patrick McCurdy, who is an associate professor in the Department of Communication at Ottawa U. His research focuses on the study of media as a site and a source of social struggle. Since 2014, he's focused on the polarized debate over at the Athabasca oil sands. In April 2024, together with Dr. Chris Russell, he received an Insight grant from SSHRC for a 4-year research project titled Greenwashing and the Energy Transition, a framework for assessing net zero communication in the Canadian oil sand sector. And Dr. Chris Russell is an associate professor in the School of Journalism and Communication and academic director at Re.Climate at Carleton University. His current work focuses on problems of disinformation and denial and their relevance to climate action. First, co-edited Critical Approaches to Climate Change and Civic Action, which is a collection exploring conceptual invention in public forms of climate action. We're excited to have Chris, Patrick, and Melissa with us today, and I'll hand it over to Chris to start our discussion.
Great. Thank you, Gada. Thank you also to Niv, Emma, and Jessica on the Re.Climate team for all their support of our webinar today. And of course, to all of you for coming out to engage with this issue. So, what we want to do is really open or join a discussion on greenwashing and the energy transition with attention to the fossil fuel industry in Canada, using the case of Pathways Alliance as an example. As Gada mentioned, Pathways, and as you can see on this slide, is a group of 6 companies that are effectively the oil sands sector from a production point of view, not only accounting for 95% of production, but driving the expansion of that production upward into the future. They launched in 2021 as Oil Sands Pathways to Net Zero, relaunched in 2022 as Pathways Alliance, folding in some other oil sands organizations doing research and community engagement under their umbrella, and then really introduced themselves to Canadians widely and residents of Canada with their Let's Clear the Air advertising campaign, which you can see on the next slide here. So the branding of the oil sands as an energy transition and climate tech, climate action alliance was done probably for obvious reasons to this crowd, but to change public perception of the companies, to access net zero acceleration support from the government, and to retain social license to continue expanding production during a climate-aware political moment, if I can put it like that. And it's these goals that required rebranding from a climate laggard or even climate denier to a site of innovation for climate tech and decarbonization solutions. And so that's what they, along with all other carbon majors in the Western world, have done or tried to do. And in doing so, they explicitly invited Canadians to come see their net zero plan. So we decided we would accept. We accepted the invitation. We had a desire to start to widen the range of participants in the energy transition and net zero conversation, and thought that if we could contribute an evaluation of the trust and integrity of some of the key actors and key claims that are taking up a lot of space in those debates, that might be helpful. So as academics, this high-minded goal means we did something radical, which is what academics do when faced with life and death problems. We wrote a paper. I think many of you had access to it in advance. Just know I'm trying really hard not to ask those of you in the chat whether you did the reading in advance of class today. But in a nutshell, what we did is we went and had a look over the course of the last year. We figured out how to detect and document greenwashing when we see it. We figured out how this works in the Canadian context, and we figured out how to evaluate the credibility of a net zero plan. So just as one thing off the top before I throw it over to Melissa and Patrick, in my view, at least, what we present today is important, not because Pathways is an evil alliance that's hell-bent on turning Earth into Mordor, but as you can see on this slide, they've become a big part of our information environment. And this is important for systemic reasons, because we know that consumers and capital and good vibes and smiley face emojis flow to climate protection plans and brands. And we know that if an actor or an alliance gains an advantage by lying about their efforts, say a BP, for example, and that if that goes unchecked, has been the case for a long while to a significant degree, then others will follow with that strategy. Others will exaggerate and overpromote and lie to hold their market role, maybe even exaggerating to stand out a bit. And they'll tell themselves that this is just the nature of the world. This is how things work in a capitalist market, and they will retain the ad agencies that excel in this. And before long, the ambient distrust that follows from this ambient deception is going to destroy the conditions for an energy transition much quicker and more effectively, in my view, than any authoritarian government or climate denier influencer on YouTube ever could do. And so it's really to try to interrupt this dynamic that we came together to infuse a research for accountability perspective in our paper. What that means may be a little opaque, although I think Melissa will touch on examples that begin to give some shape to that. But we wanted to infuse that in the paper, but also in our conversations with people, so that there'd be an evidentiary base to call upon when the parties responsible for challenging people who, if they say false things on purpose for money, if those people get to doing their jobs and holding those people accountable. And so this is a bit more of a thing that's done more frequently with academics involved in other places, but we see a place for that too. So to advance this conversation, basically we did three things that we'll share with you today. We needed to figure out how to detect greenwashing generally and recognize its role in the oil and gas playbook. We need to understand the role of greenwashing in linking people's opinions of the oil sands to questions other than those of carbon emissions, other than those of environmental justice and climate liability and harm and racism, but instead to link people's opinions of the oil sands to whether or not that organization is consistent with Canadian identities and values, and whether or not that organization supports things that many people associate with being a good Canadian: clean energy, avoidance of pollution, support of friends and allies, collective investment in our future. And so we need to know how opinions of an industry get wrapped up, not with what they're doing, but with associations with Canadian identity. And then we need to know if the net zero plan is credible. So Melissa, in a minute, is going to give us an overview of greenwashing, how it can be defined, detected, documented, and situate this in the context of fossil fuels, or as much of that as she can do in 10 minutes. Melissa has worked on the detection framework she's going to share quite intensely for a while, tested it in practice, and used it to open conversations with people that are trying to catch greenwashing, but also those that want to avoid it in the work they might do in the creative industries. Then Patrick's going to concretize some of this in the Canadian context by talking about the relationship of the Oil Sands and Pathways Alliance to Canadian identity, a question he's worked on, as God has said, for a long time, driven in part, I like to imagine, from his days living in Calgary and former life as an employee of Petro-Canada. And then with the time left, I'm going to show you what happened when we went looking for receipts on Pathways net zero plan. So over to you, Melissa.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Great to be with all of you. Thank you all for joining. In my segment, I'm going to talk about defining, detecting, and documenting greenwashing. But first, we might ask, why does it matter? Why should we care about greenwashing? One of the most important reasons to identify greenwashing is to be able to hold fossil fuel companies and their enablers accountable for their contributions to climate change. This is as true in the court of public opinion as it is in legal court. In many cases, the most damaging companies have been engaged in some kind of greenwashing for decades. Now, let's look at this definition of greenwashing we have here. It's greenwashing, as we know, it's a prominent form of climate disinformation. It's highly problematic. I really want to stress the phrase in this definition of intentionally or not. Many people define misinformation versus disinformation in this way. They'll say the difference between mis and disinformation is one of intent. So misinformation about greenwashing would be unintentionally promoting false information, while disinformation would be intentional false information. I actually don't really agree with that distinction in one particular way, which is that for consumers, the intent doesn't matter. It's the effect of greenwashing that matters. A consumer can't tell the difference if an ad campaign is trying to deceive them or if it accidentally deceives them. It's deception no matter what. In a court of law, on the other hand, intent matters a great deal. Litigators have to prove intent to harm. So the standards of evidence are different in legal cases, and arguably so are the definitions of misinformation versus disinformation around greenwashing. So for the purposes of generally talking about greenwashing as disinformation, I'm not going to make that distinction of misinformation, disinformation. And when we get to the legal cases, we can make a greater distinction. Okay, so on the next slide, that greenwashing definition that you just saw on the previous slide comes from this academic journal article, which I had the privilege of working on with colleagues at the Climate Social Science Network. We developed an assessment tool for anyone to use that's in this article, and I'll share the link after my presentation. This assessment tool is for anyone to use. It's for journalists, it's for consumers, it's for researchers, advocacy groups, and it helps you determine whether a campaign or a message or a program is engaged in greenwashing. In the next few slides, what I'm going to do is take you through, just go back, one more second. In the next few slides, I'm going to take you through how the assessment tool works. So maybe while I'm doing this, what I'm going to ask you to do kind of as a thought experiment is hold in your mind a particular ad or a tweet or a report that you think is perhaps greenwashing. And then as we go through the examples, maybe we can see together whether your example stands up to the detection test. So there are three categories, as you see on this slide, that I'm going to go into. Sorry, one more time back. These three categories: impact, alignment, and communication. Okay, now let's go to the next one. We'll talk about impact. When it comes to impact, in this assessment tool, we look at 5 different criteria. The first one is selective disclosure. This is one of the most common things we see in greenwashing. Some things are divulged and other things are suppressed. Empty claims, also very common. This category would include things like saying, we'll be at net zero by 2050, which is, of course, unverifiable in the present. Other examples might be promoting technologies or innovations to mitigate climate change that are not yet proven or not yet at scale. Lies, okay, speaks for itself. Not credible, also somewhat speaks for itself. And irrelevant. These are all ways to look at the impact of greenwashing. Okay, in the next slide, we have alignment. Alignment has these 4 categories. The first, which is I think a really important one to think about, is the alignment between what a company says it's doing and what it's actually doing. So corporate responsibility, CSR, all of these kinds of efforts are often, they sound great, they look great in annual reports, but is the company or organization actually doing what it says it's doing? One example of this kind of in-betweenness would be when organizations create public-private partnerships with environmental groups. This allows them to build their reputation, but often it does not result in climate action. So you really have to kind of dig a little bit and see whether that public-private partnership is anything more than just in name only. Political spin is another very clear case of misalignment that Pathways has been heavily involved in, which is on the one hand saying they're moving toward green outcomes, and on the other, they're lobbying against those very same green outcomes by the Canadian government. Dubious certification and labels. These are often voluntary self-regulating practices that companies or other organizations engage in that allows them to try to sidestep any sort of legal rules or regulations. And co-opted endorsement is where, organization A might say it's doing something green, but they have an affiliation with organization B, which is not doing something green. So here too, it requires a little bit of digging on your part to understand the affiliations of those companies. Okay, next slide, we have communication. These four criteria are, again, fairly self-explanatory, so I won't go through them in detail, but just basically to run you through them. Is there proof for statements that the organization is making? And they should be required to provide some standard of proof for their claims, at least through links, footnotes, whatever else it is, which we could talk about in the genre of advertising, which is often kind of low on detail and high on image. Jargon, if you don't understand what they're saying, chances are nobody else will. Vagueness and misleading symbols, again, so familiar, the sky, the clouds, the blue, and so on, that kind of masquerades as green. Okay, moving to the next slide. Now we're going into the second category, which is documenting greenwashing. When it comes to documenting greenwashing, we can consider three practices that advocates, researchers, journalists, and litigators are increasingly involved in. Those are investigations, bans, and litigation. And of course, I draw your attention to this very relevant case here on the screen, where the Canadian Competition Bureau has launched an official investigation into the marketing practices of the Pathways Alliance regarding their false and misleading environmental representations. Okay, on the next slide, I'll give you an example of some investigations. These examples are taken from the US case. There has been a spate of congressional hearings. There was one just a few weeks ago, which is the one you see on the left there, April 24. All of these hearings are trying to bring fossil fuel companies and their enablers to account for their role in accelerating greenhouse gas emissions. And I will also share the links to these hearings because the hearings themselves and their testimony are extremely valuable for setting a precedent for what groups can do later. They also provide very important evidence because a lot of these cases require discovery by the companies involved. So a company receives a subpoena, they're required to provide documentation of whatever greenwashing they're accused of, and that goes into the official record and it's publicly available. So that's really a treasure trove of data for people to use. Okay, moving to the next slide. I'm sorry if I'm going very quickly. I really want to make sure I get all of this out to you. And again, I'll put links in the slide and we can always discuss following up. Okay, bans. Now, fossil fuel advertising bans are a really interesting, newer dimension of trying to stem the tide of greenwashing. The effectiveness of bans lies not only in whether the ban actually passes, but in the idea that it plants in people's minds about the illegitimacy of greenwashing campaigns and the organizations that engage with them. So, the need for brands to protect their reputations and the negative effect that calls for bans can have on these organizations' reputations are a really important way of getting these organizations in line. Some companies may just decide that it's not worth the reputational damage to engage in advertising that risks being called greenwashing and then gets calls for a ban. I draw your attention for the Canadians in the call to this example with the Greenpeace Canada, which was able to, after a series of complaints to the Competition Bureau, convince Shell to remove claims to drive carbon neutral in their Canadian advertising. I confess this was somewhat of a partial victory because Shell continued to make those claims in other countries. So it was really just the calls in Canada that succeeded in removing the ads from the Canadian context, but the complaint has not yet gone global. So that's something we can also discuss. Okay, next slide is just another couple of examples of successful bans in different countries. Again, I think these kinds of precedents are really great. They offer models and templates for how other countries can get on this same bandwagon. And of course, there's that multiplier effect, right? The more bans that you hear about, talk about, the more journalists discuss them, the more advocates discuss them, the more legitimacy there is for these kinds of approaches. The next slide is fossiladban.org. This is a billboard in Sydney, Australia, from a campaign that ran over the last year. The next slide again shows some very powerful work by the UK Advertising Standards Authority. That's their watchdog. They have done some very impressive work trying to, just getting the word out there about different companies and their very misleading advertising. Okay, and so now let's go to the next slide. One last slide on the bans. We have Bill C-372, an act respecting fossil fuel advertising that's currently underway in the House of Commons. And one more example on the right is the case of Ireland and their claims or proposal for the prohibition of fossil fuel advertising. It sounds like some people in the call have worked on C-372, so we have some really knowledgeable experts here on the call. Okay, finally, I'm going to talk about litigation. So let's go to this next slide. Just wanted to show you a few examples here of very effective lawsuits. Effective not just for their outcomes, but again, for this kind of momentum that they create by just giving other jurisdictions the idea and the sense of the right to bring forward these cases. I refer here to DSMOG because they have a whole sort of section on their website where they're tracking the lawsuits moving toward climate accountability. So that's a very handy resource, but there are many other resources, of course. On the next slide, I just wanted to mention ways that litigation makes use of evidence. So as academic researchers, one of the things that Chris and Patrick and I think about when we're writing our journal articles is, first of all, making them publicly available. That was really important to us to publish in an open access journal so that it was not behind a paywall, but actually available to anyone who wanted to read it. But then also, litigators, journalists, and others, they can use the information that we collect, the data that we collect for their cases. And the same is true for advocacy groups and so on. So these are just three of the, there are really dozens and dozens of fantastic examples now, thinking about fossil fuel advertising and public relations, all kinds of communications as fraud, as deception, and as disinformation. In my final slide, I just give two more quick examples of reports. Again, I'll put those links in the slide. And that concludes my segment. I'm going to pass it over to Patrick now, who's going to take it up from here. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. So what I want to do with my time is to open by situating pathways within a longer trajectory of oil sands advertising and messaging, and then connect a couple of the tactics that Melissa highlighted with some of pathway specific communication. And I can always recommend later, I can put in the chat, there's a number of different studies, articles, and books which trace how the oil sands have been sold and how this messaging has been resisted, how it's changed and evolved over time as well. There's a new book out by a colleague of mine, Jordan Kinder, called Petroturfing, which I just got in the mail last week, so I'm looking forward to reading. Next, this slide, thank you. So if we look at resistance to the oil sands, both for their environmental and their climate impact, you can trace this back almost 2 decades to about 2004 or so, 2003, 2004. But it really wasn't until 2010 onward when industry, often through the Canadian, mostly and initially through the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and then related boosters, went on this advertising offensive. And what's interesting is to see is that around 2010 as well, Ezra Levant's book, Ethical Oil, was also published. So on screen, you see in the top left, you see the initial sort of CAP campaign, Land Matters. To the right of that, the conflict oil, ethical oil, that is part of sort of the initial original ethical oil campaign. Then this goes forward to CAP's Energy Citizens campaign, and this move towards this affect-laden sort of I love energy. And then you also see in Times Square, done by the Alberta's Warren, the Canadian Energy Center, an ad taken out in Times Square. What's not on screen are some images, and there's other community grounded groups who may be facilitated in other ways. Resource Works, Canada Action, and such are also, there's a whole network of groups. And you can trace like the evolution of their advertising, but this does set the scene for Pathways messaging, which I'll get to on the next slide, please. So Pathways, there's a couple important things to point out about their campaigns. And first off, and it's detailed in the methodology section of our paper, but what we sought to do is we sought to collect all of their communication, all of the ads produced by Pathways, all of the PowerPoint presentations we could access. We also sought to get other information via ATIPs. So the article that you can read is based on any communication that we could find from June 2021 forward. You will see that the campaign consists of various things such as newspaper wraparounds, transit ads, internet video pre-rolls. I always welcome emails. Feel free to email us if you spot a Pathways ad in the wild at a hockey arena, a billboard, things like this, out front of the Eaton Center in Toronto, wherever. Feel free to email them to me because I'm really interested in collecting these. It's quite difficult and challenging to capture all of them. We do our best and we get stuff crowdsourced, but do send those this way. But what stands out about Pathways certainly is that it is a large media blitz. It's a bilingual campaign. Again, transit ads, traditional media buys, sponsored searches, which we can talk about, Super Bowl ads last year and this year as well. So there's a bunch. Next slide, please. And if we think about sports and television on screen, is an example of an ad that was run during baseball games, during Sportsnet. It's also during Hockey Night in Canada. They've run ads like this. And there's various media appearances as well. You'll see often by Pathways President Kendall Dilling. Most recently, you can see Pathways was a platinum sponsor of the Calgary Youth Science Fair. So the platinum sponsorship is for anybody who donates over $20,000. And so the only other platinum sponsor for the Calgary Youth Science Fair was the University of Calgary. And that sponsorship also comes with 20 judging spots at the science fair as well. So what we need to understand with Pathways is it's a campaign where it might have sometimes a geographic focus in some areas, but it certainly is a campaign with national reach and a strategic focus, which is really looking to maintain, both build and maintain social license for its continued extraction of bitumen by seeking to insert themselves in spaces that seem iconic to Canadians or spaces that are associated or may evoke values associated with being a good Canadian. And when we speak about Pathways, this again might seem apparent, especially to many of those of you in the room. Pathways, they're advertising as a single entity or a single organization. But again, Pathways is not one company, but they are 6 companies. And together they represent 95% of Alberta's oil sands production. And they're doing so, but acting in a single coordinated way. And this also includes the way that they are lobbying behind the scenes as well. So if we see Pathways campaign from this perspective, and we recognize that it is essentially the entire oil industry, 95% of Alberta's oil industry, oil sands industry acting in a coordinated fashion, then this campaign is a lot more aggressive than we've previously seen, and certainly makes the greenwashing that we identify in our research much more egregious. So what I want to do with the time left is to look at 2 examples. 2 different types of examples. So next slide, please. The first example is just, it's a basic example where you look at color, right? You're looking at colors of blue and white. And what I like the contrast when, as I was putting these slides together for today's talk, I was thinking through, because I have a database of oil sands ads. I was thinking through back to this CAP ad from 2010, which also uses blue and white and the word sort of a clean air, right? And so again, I think it puts into perspective that, since 2010, since 2013, there's a long history of industry using misleading communication practices. Briefly, you can look at the color blue as being associated with cleanliness and transparency and trust, whereas white's about purity and innocence. And of course, within the messaging, you could zoom in on the use of the word clear, which creates further links to ideas of transparency. And then you could zoom into, well, their net zero policy. What does that mean? Chris will get to that, but you need to, we want to appreciate the context which is being built around their use of this word net zero here. I'll zoom into the next slide, please. Which moves from, I want to move from thinking just about color and semiotics, something we do in my second year or fourth year class, to zooming into thinking about some of the words and charts which are put forward. And so the bar graph that you see on screen is actually from a Pathways slide deck. We've encountered this slide deck. It used to be listed on the Pathways website. You can't find it anymore. We have, I think, 6 or 7 variations. We've encountered this slide deck on Bloomberg News Talks. We've encountered the slide deck through government ATIPs, as well as just various Pathways presentations. So beyond looking at, and we'll get to why this graph is important, but the takeaway here is thinking critically about the framing of the Pathways Alliance project as being in the national interest, as being a national interest project. And so statements such as this tend to use the Canadian flag and the values associated with being Canadian, these positive associations. And they use these to forward their corporate objective of extracting as much bitumen as possible for as long as possible. And on screen, this ESG example, or environmental, social, and corporate governance example, the creation of this score is one of the most egregious claims, examples that we had seen, and it's fairly slick if you don't serve to unpack it. So standard ESG scores, they're linked to company disclosures. However, Pathways has frequently used a non-standard approach. And again, in our article, we provide more detail for this, but the long and the short of it is that Pathways uses scores associated directly to Canada's performance as a country to support its claims and its desires for extraction, as opposed to using scores, standard, say, ESG scores directly linked to the company's performance, the members of Pathways. So what we see is in looking at the use of these, and we can provide more detail on this again after I provide a link. But what our paper identifies, and what we can continue to see in Pathways communications, is a systematic effort to associate themselves with Canadian values such as environmental stewardship, community, economic stability, prosperity, responsibility, diversity, and diplomacy. And they do this by describing their actions in a misleading or false terms to maintain an ongoing social acceptance and approval for their extraction of fossil fuels. If you were to sum up their strategy, their advertising strategy for their entire campaign, Pathways appeals to pathos in order to misdirect from logos, which is like the facts and numbers and the reality of what their net zero plan is. I'll turn it over to Chris to delve further into what their net zero plan encompasses, and we can return to some of these advertising examples and strategies maybe in the Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you, Patrick and Melissa. I think that gives us a sense of how to look for indicators of greenwashing, how that's part of a wider oil and gas playbook, and how to understand some of the specific cultural associations Pathways Alliance and oil sands sectors working with to build connection and a sense of authenticity with their brand and with people that are exposed to it. But I think one question we also wanted to touch on was whether or not the net zero plan that they are showing us is credible or not. So I'm going to assume a little bit of familiarity with the net zero plans that are out there and steer you to our paper for elaboration or to a UN report that evaluates the credibility on net zero plans. And I can pop that in the chat in a minute. That was shared by Catherine McKenna. But I'm going to move quickly here to better contextualize some of the key points that we had spoken about in the paper around the net zero plan. So on the next slide, you'll see that the starting point for many of us was this Let's Clear the Air campaign. This is where there was really this reintroduction of the oil sands to Canadians. And in this ad, if you've seen it, which is about 30 seconds long, a guy's coming out of a field, brings his data on a tablet into an office conversation. The goal of the ad is really to reset the conversation for Pathways to say, we are real, this is here, we have a legit plan, come have a look. Initially, we were hoping to look at the plan. We could just zoom in on that iPad there, hoping to see the plan. If you go to the next shot there, you'll see that we tried that. But of course, no, turns out these are actors, of course. This is an ad, and the graph has no numbers, or the numbers and labels are blurred out. So we had to look a little harder for the actual plan. The next slide has the plan. So this is the plan people could actually access if they click through on the ads. This is the slide deck, a slide from the slide deck that was linked to Pathways website, used in presentation to government officials, as Patrick noted, drawn upon in public discussions with media, podcasters, and so on. It's gone through several iterations, but the key slide is the one on your left there from the first, one of the first decks. And I'm sorry in advance that you're sitting this afternoon in a slideshow about a slideshow. This is, I guess, the world we're in. At any rate, it's this slide on the left, or one that much like it, that was first used by Pathways Alliance, or the Alliance, to pitch their net zero plan to 3 ministers from Environment, NRCan, and ICID during CERA Week in Houston, so a big energy conference, oil industry conference in March 2022. I guess government liked what they heard, or Pathways figured that the government liked what they heard, because everything levels up soon after that. They pit the team, the oil sands Pathways to Net Zero gets rebranded as Pathways Alliance. They soak up the research and community engagement org, as I mentioned. They launch the ad campaign we were just talking about, Let's Clear the Air. The lobbying and government touch points all bump up in a major way. And in fact, the meetings become so frequent, the federal government appoints them a special government official, a Sherpa, to help Pathways Alliance navigate all the government agencies that they want to interface with. So the one on the left there is the plan. And the key thing I want to focus on here, you'll see another version of this that will be a bit larger if you're having trouble looking at the specific numbers, but as the y-axis on your left, it is tracking the emissions with a baseline of 68 megatons carbon dioxide equivalent. That's presented as the total emissions of the oil sands. The x-axis along the bottom is tracking time. So you see today, but you also see 2020 to 2030, 2030 to 2040, 2040 to 2050 to be net zero by 2050. It's a 3-phase plan. The goal is to reduce emissions by about 30% by 2030, so that it's not some vague promise to be at net zero all of a sudden at 2050, which is crucial for a credible net zero plan. And the different colors there, which we won't have time to get to, are different technologies and solutions that describe what's going to drive down their emissions. The green one on the left there is carbon capture and storage. At any rate, that's the first plan. Maybe a good start. I could see why Wilkinson and Gabot might have been curious, but of course there's a few problems. So one, that 68 MT number, as many of you will know, it's too low. It's not even close. It's not, you're supposed to disclose all your total emissions when talking about net zero, and those aren't the total emissions. The 68 number is the emissions that Pathways Alliance generates when they're making stuff that they extract into something someone will buy. So it doesn't include any of the emissions that occur when the product they sell is burned, what's often called scope 3 emissions, which for the oil sands is probably something like 80 to 85% of their total emissions. So anytime someone burns something, buys the product they burn, those emissions aren't counting as part of their net zero plan. So this was pointed out to them. They changed their ads a little bit. They put an asterisk on some of the ads to let people know it's only scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, not all emissions. And if you were looking closely at one of the ads Patrick shared, you'll see they're talking now about reducing operational emissions, which are the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, the emissions that are generated as they make their product, not from the use of that product. But then there's another problem. The 68 MT number, even with the asterisks, is probably still too low. It's not a number anyone else seems to be using. RBC Investment Advice on this notes that the government has a higher number. Energy pundits have a higher number for them. The government's number currently, and back in 2019, is in the mid-80s range, not in the 68 range. And so this has remained a bit of a muddle ever since. I'm not going to go into that. We talk a little bit about it in the paper, and some of you will be quite familiar with it. If you go to the next slide, Emma, we'll see that there's another problem. So aside from all that, we have some scientists that have come forward to say anyone using conventional methods for counting oil sands emissions, whether you're using the 68 or the mid-80s number, they're still too low. and that building on the evidence that and the studies that these scientists have done, which builds on a body of research that predates the specific study they did, that the emissions are systematically undercounted. So that's a bigger problem. If you go to the next slide, we'll see that Pathways, having already used up its asterisks, has moved to press releases. And so in this press release, which some of you may have read, or the stories that really reflected its point of view in covering the article, cited nameless scientists that were splashing around in what we sometimes call the "we have concerns" pool. The scientists aren't named. The concerns don't appear to have been shared by the scientists that peer reviewed the article during the scientific review process. And to my knowledge, I could be wrong, I don't think a correction has been sought in the journal where the study was published, which, if so, means the press release was really about discrediting the research to shape the news cycle, not to clarify what the Pathways' actual emissions are. So no one here is going to be all that surprised, I think, by what's going on. We know climate comms is a contact sport, but the point I'm trying to make here is not a complaint about this isn't how science is supposed to work. It isn't, but that's fine. What I want to emphasize is the press release was really a non-denial denial. It's the kind of thing celebrity publicists do if their clients' ketamine abuse habit gets exposed in the New York Times. They get outraged, their PR people pile up questions about inconsistencies to induce doubt, but they never go ahead and say that the study's false. So as Melissa discussed when she was talking about some of the indicators, and as you can see in the paper where we talk about this is not atypical, this idea of when challenged on having a wrong number around the emissions, trying to default to the protocol of another organization and suggest you're just following the rules. But here's the bigger problem. And Emma, if you could actually, sorry about this, scroll back to the two decks, one more. Yeah. So if you've taken a look at the two decks, you'll see a difference. It's effectively the same plan, but the numbers are now missing on the second deck in the y-axis. And in fact, interestingly, if you go retrieve access through an access to information request, which one enterprising individually did to get a look at the deck on the left to understand what Pathways told the federal government in Houston that day, you get a version of that slide on the left, but the government's actually redacted the y-axis, which blocks it out so that you don't see those numbers, which is a really curious decision. And as Patrick has said, the government, Pathways has actually retired this slide deck so that I haven't seen it for a while on their website or seen this slide depicting their plan. Now, there's lots of reasons that emissions number could have gone missing. They got really busy. They had a lot of logos and commercials and lobbying to do. And so it's hard work to lift up a plan like this. The original number could have been wrong and it would be embarrassing. Numbers like this are hard to update, especially when annoying people like me are going to look very closely at it and jump up and down and say it's wrong. And scientists are going to do annoying things like research it. And so maybe just taking it down was sort of an easier way to do it. But I think there's another reason that was probably more compelling. And Emma, if you could scroll ahead maybe 2 or 3 slides, there we go. And you'll be up, yeah, that one right there. The problem is that 2030 is coming up fast. So the plan originally started at 68 megatons and told us it was going to get by 40 to 46 megatons by 2030. So by 2030, emissions were going to be reduced by maybe 30% or so, but reduced by 22 megatons CO2 equivalent per year. But we know they're going the other way. So we know that in 2022, the emissions are in the mid-80s, not trending down to the mid-40s. We know that production in the oil sands is still surging. We know that they are continuing to expand production and producing more. And we know that the stuff that's supposed to drive down emissions, especially the green there, which is the carbon capture and storage, it isn't real yet. It hasn't started. And it doesn't seem likely they're going to make the checkpoint for the plan, the 2030 checkpoint they gave us when they were trying to clear the air and tell us they had a legitimate plan. So personally, people can draw their own conclusions and read a little bit more about this in the paper. I find it hard to conclude that they were really trying to hit that 2030 goal, which is a key part of what determines the credibility of a plan, having that 2030 checkpoint, not just pushing everything into 2050. But the other part of the credibility is being honest and public and visible and forthright when you encounter hurdles or fail. And so it's possible Pathways has come forward to say that the original plan wasn't credible. Maybe they've told the Competition Bureau investigators that the complainants about greenwashing were right. Maybe they've told Greenpeace and CAPE that the complaint is just. And if so, I guess that's all great. But it seems to me that the plan is actually to sort of PR this way through the problem by moving the goalposts, by taking down reference to this initial plan, and by saying things like carbon capture and storage will be operational or starting to work at 2030, as opposed to being at this 46 megatons CO2e by 2030. So that's the emissions. Now we have a lot to say about credibility of the plan with respect to the way it presents costs and with respect with the way it presents the scale of carbon capture and storage. But I know we're keen to get into the Q&A a little bit, so I think I'll throw it back to you, Gada, as we open that section.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris, Patrick, and Melissa for the great presentation. We will start with the questions, and we have received a few. So I'll start with this question for Melissa from McCurdy. In your opinion, how does net zero function in greenwashing to both falsely imply and secure the goal that really matters, limiting warming to 1.5? And of course, what would be required to achieve the 1.5 degrees, which is halving the emissions by 2030?
I'm only going to comment on the net zero claims in general, and I want to say there's been some very interesting research done on net zero greenwashing per se. Anytime you are making a claim that is projected into the future, there is always the risk of greenwashing, and it's very difficult. Normally what happens in those kinds of claims is that there is a projection of either technological development or funding and investment, often from the public sector, but also from the private. And these kinds of things just cannot be predicted. It's just impossible to know whether the technology will perform at scale, whether the government is going to provide the subsidies or the investments required, and whether the public will approve of those kinds of initiatives. Usually there's some sort of public commentary or requirement. So any sort of projection, I want to just add that advertising in general, this is something I think about a lot. Advertising in general is always about a future projection. It's about conveying desire for something that you may not already have, whether that's a shampoo or whether that's achieving net zero. So already I think advertising as a rhetoric, as a genre, is very complicated or compromised when it comes to greenwashing. And that's something we need to pay very close attention to. It's possible, and this is where bans come into place, it's possible that advertising is not the right medium to talk about things like net zero. In terms of the scientific need to get to net zero, because that's not my area of expertise, I'm going to stay in my lane when it comes to the advertising stuff. But I think that's really important to keep in mind, is the role of advertising itself in being deceptive from the get-go.
Yeah. And I think this is relevant to the question that I'm going to ask Chris now. And this question is from Anita Wolf. In BC, there are ads everywhere that LNG reduces global gas house emissions. Is this greenwashing? Can they say that? Because BC LNG replaces dirty coal for energy in Asia. And what can communicators do?
I would have to look a little more closely at it, but my guess would be yes, and that it would be worth looking into. Obviously, the idea that natural gas can replace coal and that the emissions profile being different for natural gas than coal means that it has a net benefit effect. That argument's been out there for a long time, and in fact was backed by some prominent environmental organizations during the fracking boom in the US, unfortunately. But I think there's been a lot more study into that question that raises doubts around its veracity. And I think it's just important to remember that natural gas is a fossil fuel, and the energy transition needs to be about transitioning away from fossil fuels.
Is there quick tips or about what communicators can do about this?
It's contextual. There's no one universal kind of communication strategy or approach that I think work absent situational awareness around the information environment you're in, knowing what its impacts are and moving forward. But I can say that there are others at Re.Climate that focus on that quite closely. And so I think if they're not already in contact with us as an organization, that we can steer them to people working on that very question.
Great, thank you. And this question is for Patrick, and it's from Amber Bennett. The Pathways Alliance marketing and communication is impressive. There are a few clever things. Are there a few clever things that you think are good strategies that climate communicators might learn from them, aside from, of course, a huge marketing budget?
That's an interesting way to think about it, is to think about how what their strategies, what works for what their strategies, or are their strategies working? I haven't thought about that in the past. So I'm not sure how to answer it. I think, you know, I think finding ways to be able to hold pathways accountable through things such as the Greenpeace and Cape complaint is sort of a way forward in terms of messaging, teaching, also media literacy as a way to for audiences to be able to make sense of sort of the claims and sort of lift up the hood a bit and see what's beneath the claims which are being made. In terms of what works, I really would have to think. I mean, I'm quite interested in terms of pathways strategies, for example, to manage to get themselves a pavilion at Egypt's COP. I have an ongoing ATIP with the government of Canada, which has been denied by, which is now at the process of being a level of complaint with the Office of the Information Commissioner to try and get this information, to think through what their advertising strategy is like. But with respect to specific strategies, yeah, I have to, off the top of my head, I couldn't riff off anything. It does make me think about the images, though, that when you look on Pathways Twitter of them handing out, you know, ice cream bars and things like this as a way to engage people, and these are interesting to think through. But I'd like to see a good old-fashioned return to culture jamming as well, and sort of like breaking apart these ads. There was a campaign recently that also used, I forget who did it, and maybe that's part of the problem, used history, or used humor as a way to intervene and call out these ads as well. But I think we need to get beyond just sort of advertising wars and really hold their feet to the fire a bit more.
Thank
Can I
you.
offer just a brief comment, Gada?
Yeah, sure.
Just that I think it's interesting to think about the demand side for the story they're telling. There's a strong desire for there to be collaborative, solution, pragmatic-based progress on this. And Pathways didn't invent some new narrative. They came inside the existing narrative of the energy transition. They came inside the conference and parties meetings. They came inside the existing climate conversation and presented themselves as another voice or perspective on this. And I get how it would be nice to not have to deal with them if that story they are telling were to be true. So I think there's just that piece of it that many of us, I think, sort of wish it would be true. In the sense that it would make things a lot easier and perhaps less contentious.
Okay, thank you. So this question is for Melissa from Matt Tegelberg. Does Pathway Alliance have ties to fossil fuel majors in US, such as Koch Industries, or is this Canada-specific greenwashing initiative?
Yes, so I did put a note in the Q&A, but it's worth answering live. So Exxon is the majority owner of Imperial, which is one of the Pathways Alliance members, and Suncor and Exxon, with Suncor being another Pathways Alliance member. Both of them are involved in a lawsuit in Colorado right now. So there's a lot of cross-border stuff going on with what Pathways Alliance is up to. It's relevant that the 6 Pathways Alliance members make up 95% of the oil sands industry, because we can then really take it as a kind of model, and so to speak, for looking at how bad greenwashing can get, and also looking at how this stuff moves across borders. This is definitely not a Canada-only strategy. And one reason it's not a Canada-only strategy is that the PR firms and ad agencies that work with these companies are themselves cross-border. They're multinational companies for the most part. So there is a lot of resource and information sharing. There's a lot of technical sharing. There's a lot of strategy sharing. I want to add to that, besides just PR firms and ad agencies, also accounting firms, technical consultants, and trade associations. So all of these are engaged in a really international network of strategizing. It's definitely not a Canada-only kind of strategy.
You know, I'll stay with you also with, for another question that's about international or US sharing, is that Also, the U.S. political system seems, more willing to investigate fossil fuel disinformation. And as someone whose actually testimony has informed this work, what advances that have happened in these discussions, and what might Canadians or Canadian conversations take away from these hearings and disclosures that are happening there?
Yeah, I would say there are, just to add to what Gada just asked me. So I provided congressional testimony at one of the hearings that I showed in my slides back in 2022 regarding the role of public relations firms in preventing action on climate change. And I would say there are three really important impacts that we can take away from that hearing, or from this spate of hearings in general that we're seeing in the United States. One, the most important, is discovery and disclosure. When the House Oversight Committee sends a subpoena to companies requesting materials related to their campaign strategy, those companies are required to provide responsive documents, and those documents become part of the public record. You can, I can give you a link right now. You can go and download hundreds of pages of emails between these oil majors about their campaign strategy. That's invaluable research. There's no other way I know of to get access to that material. The second really important reason for those hearings is reputational. Whether the company accepts or refuses to comply with the subpoena, investigators usually already have enough compromising evidence in hand to be able to point the finger at those groups. And the media coverage, again, it has this kind of knock-on effect where it affects the brand of the company, as we were saying earlier. The third reason is the precedent-setting function. Each hearing can build on the evidence and testimony of the prior one, and then these can provide key information for litigation down the road.
Great, thank you. So this is a question for our panelists, and this question is from Ingrid Ducey. How can we counter all these ads all over radio and television? I'll start with you, Melissa, or Patrick.
Yeah, I think it's a part of it is filing these ongoing sort of complaints as a mechanism to sort of hold them to account. That's so it's documenting it, logging it. Chris, you might have more on that.
Chris?
It can feel overwhelming, I think. It's meant to feel overwhelming. It's meant to be ubiquitous. It's meant to normalize the brand and integrate them into a sense that they're part of normal Canadian life and a voice in the debates that will define it going into the future. I think the regulatory piece needs to be part of the question. I think that the Competition Bureau has to do their job. I think securities regulators have to do their job. I think greenwashing shouldn't just be seen as some frustrating thing we encounter in the world, but that if it's a misrepresentation that has material consequences, that the laws and regulations in place should apply in those circumstances. I think if the Competition Bureau does find the complaint to be valid, that this is greenwashing, I think an ad campaign should be undertaken, funded by Pathways, where they apologize and cop to what they've done, ideally at the same level of impressions that they've acquired with all their other ads. And I think if that happens, have a real different kind of conversation about what's happening with this. It would be an interesting point of debate as we think about some of these examples Melissa shared around fossil fuel ad bans in other countries. So I think that's just a very interesting sort of public conversation to have, but institutions that need to uphold laws and regulations also need to do their jobs when provided with evidence of what's going on.
Chris, I want to kind of stay with you a bit on this, is that because, we understood from the presentations today that greenwashing goes beyond advertising, but it's, it's about a few other things like online searches, and you've pointed to the integration into news production and perhaps the funding of academic or scientific research. Would you elaborate more on this? And again, it's just bringing that question of how to counter that.
Yeah, so we did a little bit of this in an op-ed we wrote for the National Observer, which we can share, trying to move the conversation of greenwashing away from its historical conception around a single ad or a misleading ad campaign that may be in a bus shelter that exaggerates a claim to sell a good or service that will influence consumer decisions, to recognizing that the sort of thing we're looking at today is a much more systematic, society-wide effort to shape the ideas in debates around policies that will affect the futures we choose collectively. And so that means that it's much more difficult for regulators with the existing tools they have to make these determinations. And I think what we've seen with the sprawling, more dynamic or networked form of greenwashing, and I should mention that Ren Montgomery's work is really good on this. She worked on the detection framework that Melissa's talking about, has shown that it's really a much more updating, highly dispersed effort that draws on the full range of what ad PR companies do. It's not just crafting a specific message, it's managing all these relationships with news organizations, their digital outreach to schools and this kind of thing. But the point I want to make here is that in this case, I think, what do we do about this kind of more dynamic conception of greenwashing? I think the tools that the commissioner, the competition commissioner asked for in terms of a reverse onus provision, where if you make claims about a net zero plan, you should have to provide evidence of those, not wait for complaints to roll in from NGOs or from academics or that kind of thing. I think that would be an important step forward. And I think the second thing we need to discuss when we're talking about this more widely dispersed form of greenwashing, and I'm no antitrust expert, I'm no legal expert, but I can tell you that if TikTok and Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Amazon all showed up as Techways Alliance to reshape the tech conversation in Canada, that wouldn't be cool. Yet this is what has happened with the oil sands coming forward to reshape the climate policy conversation. And so there is a reason to be careful around antitrust claims when companies come together to advance sustainability. They relax the antitrust provisions in that case because it's for a social good. But in this case, I think we've raised enough questions about whether this is a legitimate move to sustainability. And so I think those questions are at least worth having a conversation about with this kind of concentration of corporate power and its influence on climate policy.
Great, thank you. So this question is for Melissa from Ramel Mayer. I worked on children's environmental show for TVO aimed at kids age 6 to 9 years. Do you have suggestions for children that young to become aware of greenwashing, how to develop that literacy skill?
Yeah, I'm going to totally date myself here, but those of you who watched the Polka Dot Door in the 1970s will know that there was a fantastic segment they had on that show where they would take kids through the dot and go live. So, most of the show is about puppets. And then they would actually go to a factory or go to a site where workers were working and they would, kids could learn about it. So I would just love to see something like that back on TVO, where kids are taken to, a plastic recycling facility and shown how recycling doesn't actually recycle whatever the percentage is in Canada. I don't know what in the US, it's something like 90% of plastics are not recyclable. That kind of thing, I think can really, really get kids thinking and talking. It's also ways that they can then bring that back into their homes. Anything that allows them to practice change in their homes and understand it through that television show, I think would be fantastic. I mean, I'm not a K-12 curriculum person. I teach at the university level, but it's actually amazing sometimes how some of the tactics of media literacy I practice with my undergrads is actually applicable for much, much younger kids. Kids are very, very smart. They're very savvy. They're aware when lies are being told, and helping them make that distinction between what is actually good for the environment, what is actually bad for the environment. I think you would get a lot of uptake by those kids.
If I could just jump on that quickly, only just to do a plug for something I did a number of years ago. I did which is for older, maybe high school students, if there's high school teachers around. And Chris published an essay in this, but I did a graphic novel called The Beast, published in 2018, which was meant to explore some of the issues around looking at the tropes that energy companies, the oil companies use in producing in making ads for the oil sands, as well as looking at some of the debates over things. So I'll put a link to that in the chat, but just a plug for something that it's been used at some universities and also in high schools as a way to delve into media framing and sort of talk a bit about media literacy and greenwashing and things. Not appropriate for the TVO crowd, younger crowd, but certainly maybe something for high schools. It's free to download, so I'll put a link to that in the chat.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you. And this question is for Chris and Patrick from Pat Litzia. Are Re.Climate or any other organizations working in media literacy on climate communication and greenwashing campaigns?
So my mind's actually gone to this TVO history, this set of memories in Melissa. I'm like, I want to see those kids use the detection framework that Melissa and Ren and Steph Hill, who's here as well, who I should have shouted out. I think that would be amazing. So maybe that's something we can do to intervene in this space and kind of have a small army of civic coders engaging with what's going on. There's a larger debate to be had around media literacy. I see why it's an attractive solution. It is an important set of techniques. I see value in it. And in some ways, something like the SIFT framework, which is a standard digital literacy media framework, is not that different from what we did in our study in terms of stopping, investigating, tracing the claims back to the source and looking for better sources. So there's some value to that kind of work. We aren't currently doing it. We're trying to give ourselves a map of what's going on in the larger information environment, so we have better situational awareness around the scope of what's happening and the impacts. And again, I think we definitely need institutions that have responsibility for acting on misrepresentations or fraudulent claims to do what they're expected to do. And without a sort of systemic or structural response, pushing this down to individuals to sort of navigate the flow of information in front of them, while important and valuable and deserving of time, it won't be enough.
All right, thank you. Patrick, do you want to add anything?
No, just to say this is something that is on our radar for this shirt project that we have. It's one of the objectives is to try and like see what resources and things that we can bring together going forward. So yeah.
Okay, great. So, and this question is for you again, Patrick, from Liz Addison. Is Pathways using social media to target malleable audiences in a similar way that many right-wing actors do? Is what we're seeing on traditional media only the tip of the iceberg?
It's a great question, and I think it's something that we didn't get too much in our presentation, but Chris in his reply sort of spoke about it, and we've pasted the link to the Observer piece in there, and that, you know, a lot of the greenwashing, the examples I gave you are sort of like, you know, what you might call your dad's greenwashing, sort of old school greenwashing, and thinking through, there's a need to also investigate and think through what does greenwashing look like in the age of social media sponsored search, manipulated search, and that sort of thing. When you look at just their sort of their tweets are very bog standard, right? I can't speak to how what their manipulated searches are like. This is work that we have a piece that's ongoing that you can also read in the Observer piece. But it's certainly something that we're aware of. But I see, you know, most of it's a fairly standard corporate strategy in terms of what they're tweeting and what they're posting on LinkedIn and Facebook. And part of this is that the messaging is designed to mobilize a motivated base, right? They're looking to get sort of people who are working in the industry whose identity and livelihood is tied into what they're doing, and get them to mobilize their own social networks to share this. And this is a strategy that, with the rise of energy citizens and the sort of the turn inward, recognizing that we can't just sort of fight the NGOs, activists, and the public. We need to mobilize our paid workforce and get them to share our messaging. So the social media, the general social media messaging is what we're seeing is just like standard sort of tweets and things. But lifting up the hood on sponsored search and these other elements is actually a really important thing to do.
Great, thank you. And I'd just like something to add, since we are speaking about social media, as someone who has observed social media and you've followed, this first wave of ethical oil, ethical oil that started in 2010. Why is this issue bound with national identity? I mean, why people, or how does it come that someone feel love for an industry and an animosity that trying to hold those, to hold this industry accountable, especially that this industry is a kind of is a symbol of significance of wealth disparities, and it's it's known for its environmental impact. So why is this all together?
Well, I can speak briefly. I mean, Melissa has got a great whole book on nationalism and branding. Could jump into this too. But I just think like the use of affect and emotion is an important one. People want to feel good about what they are, about their jobs. This is often a big part of our identity. And so to create this fusion helps further the corporation's objective to be able to get unquestioned sort of buy-in to their objectives, which is to extract for as long as possible, as much as possible. And so I think part of the challenge is to in encountering this discourse is that it's like especially with how it's so tightly tied to nationalism is like asking corporations to follow through on ensuring that it's it's too long of a tangent, but it's challenge. There's a need to sort of challenge this unpatriotic narrative that is sort of interwoven with this, and the idea that it's not unpatriotic to think about Canada's long-term interest is to build a more sustainable, sort of diversified energy system and not continue through extracting fossil fuels. But yeah, it's a long-serving narrative on it. But maybe Melissa could jump on that.
Well, we have only, we've actually, so it's 1:15 ET now, and we're ending, but thank you so much. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Chris, for sharing your insights. Really great insights that we heard today. We truly appreciate your time, and we look forward to your next research. And thank you everyone for joining our webinar. Thank you for the questions and the comments and inquiries and the fantastic energy that we witnessed today. For those of you who are not already following Re.Climate, please sign up on our website. Niv will share a link in the chat. Our website will share more evidence and research-based and practical insights in our upcoming webinars. If you have any questions about our webinar, please send them to me, gada@reclimate.ca. And finally, we'll include a link to a follow-up survey, which will appear once we leave the webinar. Please take moments to provide your feedback at this time, and it's really important for us to hear what you learned and what you want to learn from these webinars. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.